They looked at me like I was nothing. That morning in the marble hallway of Beaumont and Associates in Lyon, the hiring manager didn't even bother to soften the blow. He just said it, plain and direct, with the kind of cold efficiency you'd use to discard yesterday's newspaper. I didn't get the position, and then, as I stood there trying to process the rejection, he added something that would change everything. He said I was useless. That word hung in the air between us, sharp and cruel, and I felt something inside me crack open, not with sadness, but with a kind of clarity I'd never experienced before. I walked out of that building into the grey October drizzle, and instead of going home to nurse my wounds, I made a decision that would turn my entire existence upside down. My name is Claire Dupont, and until that moment, I had spent 28 years of my life trying to fit into boxes other people had built for me. I grew up in a small apartment in Marseille with my mother, who worked 3 jobs just to keep us afloat after my father left when I was 7. She always told me that education was the ladder out of poverty, that if I worked hard enough and followed the rules, success would eventually find me. So I did everything right. I studied until my eyes burned, graduated with honors from the Université de Provence, moved to Lyon with nothing but a suitcase and a dream, and spent 2 years sending out applications to every respectable firm in the city. Beaumont and Associates was supposed to be my breakthrough, the moment when all that sacrifice finally paid off. Instead, it became the catalyst for something I never saw coming. The rain soaked through my jacket as I walked aimlessly through the streets of Vieux-Lyon, past the Renaissance buildings and the tourists with their cameras, past the smell of fresh bread from the boulangeries and the sound of laughter from the café terraces. Everything felt distant, like I was watching my own life through a foggy window. I kept replaying the manager's words in my head, that single devastating adjective that had somehow managed to summarize my entire worth in 6 letters. Useless. I thought about calling my mother, but I knew she would just tell me to dust myself off and try again, to be grateful for the opportunity to have even gotten an interview. I thought about going back to my tiny studio apartment and hiding under the covers until the shame passed, but instead I found myself standing in front of a building I'd walked past 100 times, but never really noticed before. It was an old community center on Rue Saint-Jean, the kind of place that looks like it's been forgotten by time, with peeling paint and a handwritten sign in the window that said they offered free courses in everything from pottery to computers. Through the glass I could see a group of elderly people sitting in a circle, laughing at something one of them had said. There was a woman teaching what looked like a painting class to a handful of teenagers, who seemed more interested in their phones than the canvases in front of them. And in the corner, almost hidden from view, there was a small desk where a man with silver hair and kind eyes was sorting through papers. I don't know what made me push open that door. Maybe it was desperation, or maybe it was the universe giving me a not-so-subtle hint that I'd been looking for validation in all the wrong places. But the moment I stepped inside, something shifted. The man at the desk looked up when I entered, and his face broke into a warm smile that reached all the way to his eyes. He introduced himself as Philippe Moreau, the director of the center, and before I could even explain why I was there, he was pulling out a chair and offering me a cup of coffee that tasted like it had been sitting on the burner for hours. I told him everything. About the interview, about the rejection, about that word that had hollowed me out from the inside. And he listened, really listened, in a way that nobody had in longer than I could remember. When I finally stopped talking, he leaned back in his chair and said something that sounded so simple at the time, but would become the foundation for everything that came next. He said that maybe I'd been measuring my worth with the wrong ruler, and that the skills and passion I'd been trying to sell to corporations might actually be exactly what the forgotten people in our community desperately needed. Philippe explained that the center had been struggling for years, surviving on minimal funding and the goodwill of a few dedicated volunteers who were spread too thin to make a real impact. They offered programs for children whose parents couldn't afford private tutoring, for immigrants trying to learn French and navigate the complexities of building a new life in a foreign country, for elderly residents who had been left behind by the digital age and felt increasingly isolated from a world that was moving too fast for them to keep up. What they didn't have was someone with organizational skills, someone who understood systems and efficiency, someone who could help them reach the people who needed them most. He looked at me with an intensity that made me uncomfortable and asked if I would consider volunteering just for a week, to see if I could help them restructure their programs and maybe create some kind of coherent schedule that would maximize their limited resources. I should have said no. I should have told him that I needed to focus on my job search, that I couldn't afford to waste time on something that wouldn't lead to a paycheck. But instead, I heard myself saying yes. The next morning, I showed up at the center at 8 o'clock sharp, dressed in the same professional clothes I'd worn to my interview, ready to treat this volunteer position with the same seriousness I would have given to any paid job. Philippe introduced me to the other volunteers, a motley collection of retired teachers, university students doing community service hours, and a woman named Isabel, who had been coming to the center for 3 years after her husband passed away, and she found herself drowning in loneliness. They were warm and welcoming, but I could see the exhaustion in their faces, the weight of trying to do too much with too little. I spent that first day just observing, taking notes on my laptop about the flow of people through the building, the gaps in their programming, the resources that were being underutilized. I noticed that the computer lab sat empty most afternoons, while there was a waiting list for the evening classes, because people couldn't get there until after work. I saw that the children's tutoring program was turning away kids because they didn't have enough volunteers, while the painting class had 3 teachers for only 5 students. By the end of the week, I had created a complete reorganization plan. I proposed shifting the computer classes to different time slots to accommodate various schedules, implementing a sign-up system that would help them track attendance and identify patterns, and creating partnerships with local universities to recruit student volunteers who could help with tutoring in exchange for community service credits. I suggested reaching out to local businesses for donations of supplies and equipment they were planning to discard, and I even drafted a social media strategy to help them reach more people in the community who might benefit from their services but didn't know the center existed. Philippe looked at my presentation with tears in his eyes and told me that in 1 week I had accomplished what they'd been trying to figure out for 3 years. He offered me a position as program coordinator, a title that sounded impressive, but came with a salary that was barely above minimum wage. I accepted without hesitation. The transformation didn't happen overnight, but it happened faster than any of us expected. Within a month, we had doubled our attendance. The computer lab was full every afternoon, with elderly residents learning to video chat with their grandchildren and immigrants, practicing their typing skills for job applications. The tutoring program expanded to serve 30 children, with university students showing up in waves to help with homework and reading practice. We started a job skills workshop, where I taught resume writing and interview techniques, sharing everything I'd learned from my own years of rejection and failure. And something strange began to happen. The people who came through our doors started looking at me with something I'd never seen directed at me before. It wasn't pity or politeness or the professional distance I'd experienced in corporate settings. It was gratitude, real and raw and overwhelming. There was a woman named Marie, 73 years old, who had been terrified of computers her entire life, but desperately wanted to be able to email her daughter who had moved to Canada. I spent hours with her, patiently explaining how to click and type and navigate the strange digital world that had left her feeling obsolete. The day she successfully sent her first email, she cried and hugged me so tightly I could barely breathe, and she kept saying thank you over and over like I'd given her the greatest gift imaginable. There was a teenage boy named Antoine whose parents were working multiple jobs and couldn't help him with his schoolwork. He was failing math and on the verge of dropping out, convinced he was stupid and would never amount to anything. I worked with him 3 afternoons a week, and when he passed his exam with a score high enough to get into a technical program he'd been dreaming about, he told me I was the first person who had ever made him feel like he mattered. If you've ever felt like you weren't enough, like the world kept telling you that your efforts didn't measure up, I want you to know something important. Your worth isn't determined by the people who rejected you or the opportunities that passed you by. Sometimes the universe closes a door not because you're lacking, but because you're meant for something bigger than you can see from where you're standing. And if you're watching this right now and feeling lost or discouraged, I hope you'll take a moment to leave a comment below and let me know what brought you here today. Share your story, even if it's just a few words, because I promise you, someone else who's watching needs to hear it. Let's build something real together in this space. 3 months into my work at the center, something happened that would test everything I thought I understood about success and validation. I received an email from Beaumont and Associates, the same company that had rejected me so brutally. Apparently, someone had seen the social media campaign I'd created for the community center, which had started gaining attention not just locally, but across the region. News outlets had picked up stories about the transformation happening in this forgotten corner of Lyon, about how one small organization was making a tangible difference in people's lives. The email was from a different manager, someone higher up in the company, and it was an apology of sorts. They acknowledged that they had made a mistake in their initial assessment, and they wanted to offer me a position in their corporate social responsibility department with a salary that was triple what I was making at the center. They wanted me to help them develop community outreach programs that would improve their public image and demonstrate their commitment to social good. It was everything I had wanted 6 months ago, wrapped up in a neat package with a bow on top. I sat in Philippe's office staring at the email on my phone, feeling like I was standing at a crossroads where both paths led to completely different versions of who I could become. Philippe didn't try to influence my decision. He just said that whatever I chose, I should make sure it was for the right reasons, and that money and prestige were fine motivators, but they wouldn't keep me warm at night when I was lying in bed questioning whether my life had meaning. I thought about the corporate offices with their sleek furniture and their mission statements printed on expensive paper, about the performance reviews and the strategic planning sessions and the carefully managed brand image. And then I thought about Marie's tears when she video chatted with her daughter for the first time, about Antoine's smile when he showed me his acceptance letter, about the elderly man who had been coming to our technology classes and told me that for the first time in 5 years he didn't feel invisible anymore. The decision should have been harder than it was, but something had fundamentally changed in me during those months at the center. I had spent so many years chasing external validation, trying to prove my worth through titles and salaries, and the approval of people who would forget my name the moment I left the room. But working with the community had shown me a different kind of success, one that couldn't be measured in quarterly reports or performance metrics. It was in the small moments of connection, in the way a child's eyes lit up when they finally understood a difficult concept, in the gratitude of someone who had been struggling in silence and found a place where they belonged. I replied to the email from Beaumont and Associates and declined their offer. I told them that I had found my calling, and it didn't involve helping corporations polish their public image. It involved showing up every day for people who had been told, in one way or another, that they were useless, and helping them discover their own inherent worth. The months that followed were a whirlwind of growth and challenges. We secured a grant that allowed us to expand our programming and hire 2 additional staff members. We partnered with local schools to provide after-school programs for at-risk youth, and we started a job placement initiative that helped immigrants and long-term unemployed residents find meaningful work with employers who were willing to look beyond conventional resumes. My mother visited from Marseille and walked through the center with a look of wonder on her face, watching me interact with the people whose lives I'd become part of. She pulled me aside at the end of the day and told me that she had spent years teaching me to climb the ladder of success. But what she hadn't understood was that success looks different for everyone, and sometimes the highest achievement isn't reaching the top of someone else's ladder, but building your own that leads to a destination worth arriving at. But the moment that truly crystallized everything came on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, almost exactly 1 year after my rejection from Beaumont and Associates. I was in the main room, helping a group of elderly residents set up their email accounts when the door opened and a young woman walked in. She looked exactly like I had looked that day I first entered the center, shoulders hunched against the weight of disappointment, eyes red from crying, holding herself together with visible effort. She approached the front desk where Isabel was working, and said that she'd just been rejected from a job she really needed, and someone had told her that this place might be able to help. Isabel called me over, and when the young woman started telling her story, I recognized every word because I had lived them myself. The endless applications, the hope that built up before each interview, the crushing weight of being told you weren't good enough. I sat with her for over an hour, not trying to fix her problems or offer empty platitudes, just listening and sharing my own journey from that moment of devastation to this place of unexpected purpose. Before you move forward with this story, I want to pause and acknowledge something real. Each person watching this has their own journey, their own moments of rejection and resilience. Take a second and share in the comments what area of your life you're trying to transform right now, or tell me about someone you know who needs to hear a story like this. Your voice matters here, and I read every single comment because your experiences inspire the stories I choose to share. Let's keep building this community together, where vulnerability is strength and every story has value. As I watched that young woman leave the center with something resembling hope in her eyes and a list of resources I'd compiled for her, I realized that my rejection from Beaumont and Associates hadn't been an ending at all. It had been a redirection towards something I never would have discovered if everything had gone according to plan. The job I'd wanted so desperately would have put me in a cubicle organizing spreadsheets and attending meetings that could have been emails, contributing to the profit margins of people who already had more than they needed. Instead, I had found myself at the intersection of genuine human need and my ability to meet it, and there was no corporate achievement that could compare to the fulfillment of knowing that my work created ripples of positive change in people's actual lives. The measure of a meaningful life isn't the size of your paycheck or the impressiveness of your job title. It's whether you can look in the mirror at the end of the day and feel good about the person staring back at you. Over the next several months, our center became a hub of transformation, not just for the people we served, but for the broader community. Local businesses started reaching out, not just to donate supplies, but to partner with us on initiatives that would benefit everyone. A restaurant owner, who had been struggling to find reliable employees, connected with our job placement program and hired 3 people who had been chronically unemployed, giving them not just jobs, but training and mentorship that would open doors to entire careers. A tech company donated computers and sent their employees to volunteer as instructors, and several of those volunteers told me later that teaching at our center had reminded them why they'd gotten into technology in the first place before the work became about stock options and performance bonuses. The ripple effects were impossible to track completely, but I would occasionally hear stories about someone we'd helped who then turned around and helped someone else, creating chains of generosity and support that extended far beyond our walls. Felipe retired at the end of that year, and in a ceremony that was far more emotional than professional, he handed over the directorship of the center to me. He said that when he'd met me that rainy afternoon, he'd seen someone who was drowning in self-doubt, but who had more potential than they could recognize, and that watching me grow into my purpose had been one of the great privileges of his long career in community work. His words made me think about all the people who had contributed to my journey, from my mother, who had sacrificed everything to give me opportunities she never had, to the hiring manager whose cruel words had paradoxically set me free, to every person at the center who had taught me that real wealth comes from connection and service, rather than accumulation and status. I accepted the position knowing that it would be challenging and often frustrating, that funding would always be uncertain and the needs would always exceed our resources, but also knowing that I had finally found the place where I belonged. The center continued to evolve under my leadership. We expanded our services to include mental health support, partnering with therapists who donated their time to provide counseling for people dealing with trauma, depression, and anxiety. We created a small business incubator that helped aspiring entrepreneurs from underserved communities turn their ideas into viable ventures, providing not just advice but connections to resources and networks that would have been inaccessible otherwise. We started a storytelling project where community members could share their experiences, creating a living archive of the diverse voices that made up our neighborhood. Each initiative brought new challenges and unexpected rewards, and I learned that leadership in this context meant constant adaptation, deep listening, and the willingness to admit when I didn't have all the answers. The corporate world had taught me to project confidence and competence at all times, but community work taught me that vulnerability and authentic connection were far more valuable than polished presentations. One of the most profound moments came during a particularly difficult period when our primary funding source was cut and we had to make impossible decisions about which programs to scale back. I called a community meeting expecting to face anger and disappointment, but instead found a room full of people who had benefited from our services and wanted to help. They organized fundraisers, reached out to their own networks, and volunteered extra hours to keep programs running. Marie, the elderly woman I'd helped with email, organized a bake sale that raised enough money to keep the technology lab open for 3 additional months. Antoine, the teenager who had struggled with math, recruited his entire school to participate in a community service day at the center. The hiring manager from Beaumont and Associates, the one who had rejected me so coldly, even showed up with a personal donation and an apology that sounded genuine, saying he had followed the center's work in the news and realized his initial assessment of my value had been profoundly wrong. I accepted his apology gracefully, but inside I knew that his opinion no longer mattered because I had long since stopped seeking validation from people who measured worth in such narrow terms. Looking back now, from this vantage point several years into a career that continues to challenge and fulfill me in equal measure, I understand that the worst moment of my life was actually the catalyst for the best thing that ever happened to me. That hiring manager who called me useless did me the greatest favor anyone could have done, though he certainly didn't intend it that way. He shattered the illusion that my worth could be determined by gatekeepers in expensive suits sitting behind imposing desks, judging my value based on criteria that had nothing to do with who I actually was or what I could contribute to the world. His cruelty freed me from the exhausting pursuit of external validation and forced me to look inward, to examine what truly mattered to me beyond the conventional markers of success. And in that space of painful clarity, I discovered a version of myself I never would have met if everything had gone according to my original plan. The community center is thriving now, serving hundreds of people every week and creating the kind of tangible impact that makes all the struggles worthwhile. We've been featured in national news stories about innovative approaches to community development, and I've been invited to speak at conferences about the intersection of social work and organizational management. But the moments I treasure most aren't the public recognition or the professional accolades. They're the quiet conversations with individuals whose lives have shifted because someone believed in them when everyone else had given up. The tears of gratitude from parents whose children discovered they weren't failures after all. The transformation that happens when people realize they have value beyond what any employer or institution assigns to them. These moments don't come with certificates or trophies, but they fill my heart in ways that no corner office or executive title ever could. I still think about that rainy October morning when I walked out of Beaumont and Associates feeling like the world had pronounced judgment on my worthlessness. If I could go back and talk to that version of myself, I would tell her that the rejection she's experiencing isn't a reflection of her inadequacy, but rather a redirection toward her true calling. I would tell her that the pain she's feeling is temporary, but the growth that comes from it will be permanent, and that one day she'll look back on this moment not with bitterness, but with gratitude for the way it broke her open and allowed something new to emerge. I would tell her that success isn't found in the approval of strangers who don't know her story or understand her heart, but in the alignment between her values and her actions, between what she claims to care about and how she actually spends her time and energy. Most importantly, I would tell her that she is not useless, has never been useless, and that the hiring manager's words said everything about his limited perspective and nothing about her inherent worth. The lesson I've learned and continue to learn every single day is that rejection often feels like an ending, but it's actually a beginning disguised in painful wrapping paper. When doors slam in your face, it's usually because you were trying to force your way into spaces that were never meant to contain the fullness of who you are. The universe or fate or whatever force guides these things sometimes has to be cruel to be kind, has to strip away our comfortable illusions so we can see the truth of what we're actually called to do with our limited time on this earth. And while I wouldn't wish the pain of that rejection on anyone, I also wouldn't trade the journey that followed for anything, because it led me to a life of purpose and meaning that I didn't even know was possible when I was trapped in my narrow vision of what success was supposed to look like. Now I want to hear from you, because your story matters just as much as mine does. Have you ever experienced a rejection or failure that later turned out to be a blessing in disguise? Are you currently in that painful space between losing what you thought you wanted and discovering what you actually need? Or do you know someone who transformed their life after hitting rock bottom? Share your story in the comments below, whether it's just a few sentences or a detailed account, because you never know who might read it and find exactly the encouragement they needed to keep going. And if you have ideas for stories you'd like me to explore on this channel, stories about resilience and transformation and the unexpected ways life works out, tell me about them. Let's keep building this community where vulnerability is welcomed, where struggles are acknowledged, and where every person's journey toward their authentic self is honored and celebrated.